Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Citizens' Inquiry into the South Australian Coastal Crisis. My name is Dr. Michelle Maloney. I'm the National Convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, and I'm your chair today for the first session of our Citizens' Inquiry. Welcome, everybody, to this really important discussion. We're really honoured that our speakers have made the time to join us and that you have made the time to join us today. Today we're going to have our first session, and shortly we'll be listening to our speakers, Faith Coleman, Steve Bowley, Sophia Villas, Richard Hames and Freya Higgins-Despiolis. Not in that order. I'll remind us who is speaking first and such. But I really want to welcome our speakers and very grateful for their time today. In the session today, which is scheduled for 2 hours, I'm going to introduce the Citizens' Inquiry into the South Australian Coastal Crisis and how you can share your views through our online submission or through emails and other video submissions and such. I'm going to briefly mention or tell you about the Australian Peoples Tribunal itself, and then we'll hand over to our guest speakers and we'll have Q&A at the end. Before I go to our speakers, I'll be inviting my co-host for this session, Sean Deverson, to introduce himself as well. And we're going to do 2 very quick polls, and it'll be really important if you could fill them out, because we're actually going to submit people's thoughts and feelings as well as their submissions in each collated package of material that the Citizens' Inquiry is going to manage. So Sean will tell you more about that very easy clicking on things poll to get your views and thoughts. But that's the basic program. And we should have heaps of time at the end for questions and discussion. So again, please hang on to your questions and write them in the chat. Preferably if you have them for a particular speaker, let us know. That's really helpful too. I'd like to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm a descendant of peoples from Ireland who were brought to Australia as part of the colonial project. So I, as a descendant of those people, want to acknowledge the first peoples of this continent. I think it's an act of respect, but I'm also eternally grateful for the remarkable governance system that the First Nations peoples of what is now known as Australia and further north in the Torres Strait, their governance systems and the way that they cared for country. For the focus today is on South Australia, a beautiful patch of country down the bottom of this immense continent. I'd like to acknowledge, however, that I'm just north of Brisbane, and I'd like to acknowledge the Cubby peoples and the Jinnaburra peoples on whose land I live, work and play. I would like to invite you, if you feel like it, it's become a bit of a Zoom tradition, to pop into the Zoom where you are and whose country you're on today, just as an act of respect. I also want to acknowledge modern Australia's map and the fact that although many of us are not in South Australia, we join you today in great solidarity and love and care. And I know that there are people from all around our continent joining today because we've been hearing from folks who've said thanks for us for hosting this discussion, and we're really grateful that they're with us. So what is this Citizens' Inquiry all about, and what can it offer to support our lovely human beings who care for their local places? This Citizens' Inquiry has been created by a group of independent, non-government, non-political organisations concerned about what's happening in South Australia. It's being hosted by a very small entity called the Australian Peoples Tribunal, and I'll tell you about it in a moment. And it's supported by my organisation, the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. And this particular session would not have been possible without my partner in crime, Sean Deverson from Ecolitic, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But what we're offering is we just wanted to provide a platform for people to access and share reliable information about what's happening, to hear about different responses that are being suggested, and we think, really importantly, offer a non-political, non-organisational, non-vested interest kind of space for people to share their own views. We have deep and profound respect for local, community-based knowledge, whether your local community-based knowledge has been gained through formal Western education in science, or someone who lives in a place and understands it well, or in any other way. We want to express to you our deep respect for what people know and what they care about. So the plans for this inquiry are as follows. We're in what we're calling phase 1, and we're really happy to be responsive. We don't have a formula for the type of work we do. We're planning at the moment, and we'll see how we go, we're planning 3 online sessions And these are, today is the first session, discussions, information sharing as the crisis rolls out and as it doesn't just get blown away, as things continue to develop. At each session, we'll have wonderful people sharing information from lots of different perspectives, and we'll be really encouraging people to share your views via the submission portal, which we're going to tell you all about. You'll be sick of that website by the end of today. But also the short polls that we'll do will be a small way to gather information in the way that people are feeling. If you get bored with all the talking and you want to jump off, of course, we understand. We'd love you to stay with us, but please do visit tribunal.org.au and you'll see our cuttlefish and you can click on it and you'll go to the main page for this inquiry, and there's a big bit of text in blue saying click here for the submission, and I'll tell you a little bit in a moment about what that's all about. What's going to happen if you share your info? We want you to know, unless you state very clearly, please don't share this publicly, everything that people share will be collated and put onto the website so that everyone else can see what everyone else is thinking and suggesting and doing. But in particular, a huge thank you again to Sean Deverson, because he was able to get an extended submission date for the Senate inquiry into the South Australian algal blooms, which the Greens created in July and which is actually closed. But if people would like to share their own submissions with us by this coming Tuesday, we're going to spend Wednesday collating them and then sending them off to the Senate inquiry as the beginning of community voices and views into these discussions. And if you're in organisations that have already submitted, then that's totally fine. But of course, you're welcome to submit as an individual or as a group or in any other capacity. Just to be really clear, you only have to submit your ideas once, although we're going to keep rolling and collecting as information comes in and then submitting to governments and showing to others. Unless your views change, you're very welcome to just do a submission once. The second phase will be that probably around the 10th of October, because we're going to do a big push on inviting folks to share their ideas and views and opinions. And around the 10th, mid-October, we'll collate everything we've got and send it off to every government agency and decision maker that we feel should have your views and your thoughts. And then by the very end of the year, we'll turn it into something more of a report, but it will always be based on the words, the ideas and the views of everybody else. So I hope that's clear. If you want to visit the website at any time, tribunal.org.au, and click on the cuttlefish, you'll find a very simple overview. It's not complex. This is the Senate inquiry we're referring to that Sean was able to get an extension for our submission. So that's really terrific. The submission process, we've made it as easy as possible. There are 5 questions. We're asking you to talk about the impacts of the crisis on yourself or on your business or on your mental health. We're asking you to talk about what you think has caused it, what you think are the actions we need to take, and if you see any barriers that exist at the moment to taking the actions you think are important. And then just a final number 5 is, do you have any other info? So you can just type a few answers in, or you can upload. If you don't want to write, you can just video yourself on your iPhone, submit that little file, or if you have extensive materials or you want to point everyone to your submissions to other places, you can attach whatever you want. So we hope that will be of use to people. And we've already got about 10 submissions and we hadn't even promoted it. So people are finding the portal, which is great. So that's that. Now, who the heck is this APT, the Australian Peoples Tribunal? It was basically set up by myself and a group of concerned Indigenous elders and lawyers almost 9 years ago. Pre-COVID, we actually did some in-person hearings and discussions about various issues. But really, what's it all about? We feel that in the Australian landscape, when environmental problems emerge, we often have a lot of people with resources who can lobby the government with their own opinions. Big businesses, corporations and governments often have the resources to share their views, to influence law reform, and to continue to drive the agenda the way they wish to do that. What we wanted to do was just open up a space where ordinary folks, people in small organisations or just people affected by different issues can be met with compassion and fairness and a space to share their voice. Because when issues like this happen in a community, people can be utterly devastated. It affects our mental health, our relationship with our living beings that are very important to us. And sometimes the feelings of all of these issues, as well as the fairness, get forgotten in a mad rush for technical solutions and economic agendas. So the main reason we're doing this is because we care, and it's an act of solidarity for Australians to support each other. AELA is one of the key supporters, but we never do this stuff alone. We have no funding for any of the tribunal. Nothing is controlled by anyone. It's just a bunch of concerned people. And how do we normally do it? In the olden days, we used to get together in person. We've been able to do it online for this one, but we may be able to get together next year if that's appropriate and helpful. Okay, that is enough from me. And I'm sorry that we had a slightly late start, but we will still have heaps of time for everything. And now I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand over to Sean. And Sean, are you there?
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Sean Devison. Thanks, Michelle. I'm coming to you today from Ghana country, from the city of Adelaide. As Michelle mentioned, when we initially discussed this initiative a couple of months ago, at the time, both the state and federal government response was somewhat fragmented, but we always knew there'd be room and a vehicle for a citizens' inquiry. And so we're really quite humbled and grateful today for your attendance. As Michelle's alluded to, we always promise that there'd be engagement as part of this inquiry. So we're running 2 polls. We're going to run now, a short one, and we'll run a poll at the end as well. So without further ado, I'm about to launch our first poll. It's only 5 questions. We hopefully only take about 2 minutes to answer. And hopefully you'll see this on your screen right now. A couple of questions there. Most of them are single choice. There is one ranking question, which is question number 3, I do believe. Yes, it is. If you can, just give that a 1 rating for each question, that'd be great. But please spend the next 2 minutes fulfilling that poll and I'll share the results after. Thank you.
And if anyone has questions about the poll, please just type them. Thank you so much, Sean.
Thank you.
All right, so we've run through the Citizens' Inquiry, what we're hoping to do with your important submissions and the information you share. I'm now really delighted to hand over to our speakers. Today we're going to hear from Faith, and I've lost my pen, Faith, then Freya, Steve, Sophia, and Richard. And I'll introduce them with their full names in just a moment. But Faith Coleman, welcome and thank you for joining us. Faith has about 10 to 15 minutes to give us an overview. Thank you.
Okay, so many of you have heard me speak before about the algal bloom. One of the unique things about this particular event has been the community involvement. I was watching the poll and hearing just how many people got their advice from the media and from experts and how very few made it from government. And I thought that's a really interesting reflection on this issue. And so all of the cartoons you'll see in my presentation are prepared by a lady called Chloe Williams, who does some amazing work with beach cleanups and is a dive master and all the rest of these incredible things, but also took it upon herself to prepare me a whole heap of cartoons, which are really helpful. I think it's always important to start the conversation with a discussion about the fact that not all blooms are harmful. And so the image that you can see here is actually a picture of the Bonnie upwelling last year, and it's milky coloured. And what is blooming there is a whole heap of diatoms. Now, those diatoms have a silica coating like glass, and they take nutrients out of the water, mainly ammonia and nitrate and phosphate, and they drop them down to the base of the sea floor in these little glass capsules. But they also feed the copepods, and copepods are just little crustacea like krill, but the important thing about them is they then feed the whales. So it's important to recognise that South Australia is prone to blooms. Not all blooms are bad, it's just that this particular one is a problem. There's also some really interesting phenomena happening. So in the past, when you looked at a picture of the Earth from space, there used to be this green band around the centre where most of the blooms were in the marine zone, and then you had bluer water at each pole. Over the last few decades, what we've been seeing is these 2 blue bands around the equator and greener bands of water around the temperate zone, which is where we sit within now. The reason those bluer bands are forming is because the water in those areas is now too hot for most phytoplankton to bloom, or at least the optimal number, and you've got more blooms happening in temperate zones. So this is a worldwide phenomena, and it's something that we're dealing with as a result of climate change. More locally here, when we're talking about what's happened in Australia at the moment, I think it's important to realise that this is late January this year. An anomaly is how many degrees the temperature in that marine water is hotter than normal. And so you can see that tongue of warm water coming off down near Robe in South Australia, that's somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees hotter than normal. And up where I spent a lot of my childhood, up where Exmouth and Ningaloo, you can see it's well over 4 degrees hotter than normal in those areas. And what happened is the Lewin Current got a lot hotter than normal, a lot more energy in it, and it came down and it wrapped around the base of Australia and hit South Australia at the place where the Bonnie usually comes up. And so we've had this period of exceptionally hot water off the coast of South Australia basically since November this year, and that's had some really obvious impacts. And it's not just here. Many of us talk about it being a South Australian problem, and I'm really glad to see that there are lots of people here who are not South Australian, because it's actually an Australian problem. Anthem really might need to be changed. We're now no longer necessarily, we still go by oceans, but we're also girt by blooms. And so this was this year just a snapshot of some of the media showing that we have dinoflagellate blooms in large areas of Australia, particularly along that coastline that I highlighted. Up in Ningaloo, it's now too hot, and we're getting fish just dying because they're boiling. Not boiling, but broiling at least. And the Shire of Esperance had to be different, and they've got a blue-green algae bloom for a slightly different reason, but it's related. In South Australia, this is what this little map at the top shows you, the areas that were hottest on record between January and May this year. So all of the red areas were the hottest on record since 1981. We don't have records of sea surface temperature before then. The area that's an apricot colour had 1 year that was hotter, which was 2013, and the area that is that light blue had 2 areas that were hotter in record. And so it just tells you that this year was one stinker of a hot year, and it has a lot to do with the Bonnie upwelling. But what's really interesting for me is looking at when those hot years were. And so if you look at the chart at the bottom, you've got the sea surface temperature for each of for that area for this each year, and you can see the variability from year to year as well, which is really interesting. So there's a background trend. Obviously a trend doesn't mean causation, but it shows you that we've gained about 1 degree in average in sea surface temperature over this time period, which is not very long, from 1981. And you can also see 3 arrows going down, and these are 1982, 2013, and 2024-25. You can see that each of those years has an exceptional amount of variation. So it went from cold to hot on hot to cold real quick. And each of those years is a lot hotter than any of the years around. And to see what that meant as far as environmental goes, we went back and correlated that against observations of mixotrophic dinoflagellate blooms, or dinoflagellate blooms, which is what we have here at the moment. And what we see that in 1982-83, there was a shift in dinoflagellate blooms and dinoflagellates generally around Australia. There's records of them hitchhiking. It was written in one paper. We were a lot more casual then, down the Eastern Ocean Current. And in South Australia, there's records of us losing all of our copepods, which is something we know happens with Carenia blooms and many of the other hazardous dinoflagellates. So that was interesting. It's also the year that many of our programs around seafood safety and many of our programs around researching dinoflagellates and ocean currents and sea surface temperatures started. And this is the reason why it did. In 2013-14, we had the hottest marine temperatures on record in South Australia. Again, we had a mega bloom in both gulfs. It officially was a different species mix of algae that were blooming, but written into the paper that was written up afterwards, it wrote that Carenia mikimotoi was present in low numbers. Now, we've since realised that what we thought was low numbers causes impacts, and that's an issue around the fact that our aquaculture species are incredibly tough and our native species are not. And then, of course, you can see this 2024, and I've written through to 26 because they're projecting that the heat wave will last until next autumn. And so that's of concern to me, that this is unlikely to break as quickly as we would like. Now, I don't have records back to the 80s, but in 2013, along Glenelg Beach and many of the other beaches around South Australia, we recorded in March huge amounts of seagrass and seaweed deposited on our beaches, which is way earlier than it should be. Usually we record that in June, July, August, and this was back in March. And the government at the time believed it was related to the hazardous algae bloom that we're having at the time that caused a lot of fish to die in both of the gulfs. We noticed that again this year in December. So as Christmas just passed, the photos here were taken by one of the fishermen down at Robe and Boatswain's Point, showing once again we had a huge amount of seaweed and seagrass deposited on the beach. Now, what we know about this particular form of algae that we've got, it's something called a mixotrophic dinoflagellate, which I'll explain later, is they use a slightly different nutrient profile to most species. They actually eat dissolved organic carbon. They actually eat other algae as well. And so what we think happened in both these cases is that as the water temperature got hotter than normal, all of our seaweeds and seagrasses that like cooler temperatures, especially around Boatswain's Point, died back in large amounts. And that released a huge amount of dissolved organic carbon and set off a chain of events ecologically between bacteria and things rotting and sulfate-based bacteria that produced a huge amount of food for mixotrophic dinoflagellates. Now, this is our friend Karen. The video was actually produced by one of my volunteer plankton counters. So there's a group of us now trained around the state and even more coming along every year. And I think it's just really important to put a face to a name with Karinia. I may describe her in a lot of our things as a fat bottom girl. She has a large bottom and she has two flagellas that come out and she dances around like a Spanish dancer. She's really quite beautiful if you don't think about the damage that she does. She's about 18 to 37 microns, which is tiny. A micron is a thousandth of a millimeter. And at the moment, we're dealing with somewhere around 45 quintillion cells, so billion cells at any one point in time in this bloom, just to give you an idea of the scale of the issue. She's highly vertically mobile. She goes up and down in the water column. Because she eats other things, she doesn't have to photosynthesize the way that most algae would. And so we're getting counts of huge amounts of dinoflagellates 20 and 30 meters below the surface. And she has been found in and around our ports in very low numbers. So the numbers that we're getting at the moment are 140,000 cells per litre to 75 million cells per litre, whereas we've been seeing up to 5,000 cells per litre in our ports and harbours and things for decades. And so she's been here. She's just not been anywhere near the numbers she is now. Now, one of the unique things about this group of, not entirely unique, but one of the most troubling things about this group of algae is there's something that we call mixotrophic. Trophic meaning what we eat, mixo meaning more than one source. In this case, she eats all of these other things rather than photosynthesizing. And we know that as Karinia goes into a bloom, she eats more things. So she grazes more instead of growing more. So if you're a farmer, you would consider that she's gone from acting like the grass to acting like the cow. Now, the biggest concern for us is that she is strongly influenced in her blooms by many parameters of climate change, not just one. So we know that as the CO2 concentration goes up in the water, as the temperatures increase in the water, as the availability of dissolved organic matter goes up in the water, as other things are under distress, she is more likely to graze on other things rather than photosynthesizing. And when a Karinia population does that, they grow more. And unfortunately, they also emit more carbon. So when we're talking about algal blooms being beneficial for greenhouse gas emissions, when they are doing this mixotrophic thing where they actually start eating other algae, they actually emit CO2 and other forms of greenhouse gases. When tested under conditions from pre-industrialization to current to what's now forecast, as far as how intense the light is, more CO2, high temperatures. In every scenario tested in the laboratories, mixotrophic dinoflagellates dominate. And so this is an ongoing concern for us. So this is a short video of the bloom initiation and movement prepared by a PhD candidate called Enya Chittery. And she's done this incredible job of putting together a lot of the satellites and the differences in chlorophyll. Now, even though this algae eats a lot of other algae, you can actually see it on chlorophyll indices in amongst 1,000,001 other things. So it's a little bit challenging to just use chlorophyll, but it does give us an indication of the movement of this bloom over time. What this tells us is there is no clear signature of the River Murray in here, as in there is no clear link between the discharge plume of the River Murray and where the bloom started or where it continues. In fact, the scientific committee of the government has now continually said that they can't see how that would work, which is the scientific polite version of where did that come from? And what we're also seeing is there could be the potential for multiple initiation points, which there is some theory that the Eyre Peninsula one might have started separately into the Spencer Gulf, which means that it was the environment that was right. And then this was the species that benefited from that, and then it bloomed rather than a specific point of initiation, which is interesting. And it really supports that marine heatwave hypothesis. There is a clear involvement of the area where the upwelling would normally have been the strongest. You can see the funneling as it goes through the backstairs passage, and you can see how it's also, and in this stable image now, the lack of flushing also augmented by the continual marine heatwave has meant that we're not getting the flushing in Gulf St Vincent, and it's now retained in there quite well. Many of you are familiar with the iNaturalist, and you can see not only the distribution, which tends to focus on areas where people are. Unfortunately, we've got great holes in our knowledge about what's happened elsewhere, but you can see that some species are a lot worse impacted. Down the bottom, I have 2 rows of the species that are most commonly recorded, with our leather jackets and southern fiddler rays being the most often recorded due to a lot of their biophysical characteristics that make them more vulnerable. But we're also getting significant numbers of this group of rare and endangered and threatened species within this. It doesn't take a lot, for instance, of this group at the top, these 6 that I've picked out up here, of the sea dragons or the bronze whalers or the white pointers or the giant cuttlefish or the dolphins, to die to make a big difference. And we're getting quite a few records of those. And the recent release from PIRSA of their fish watch data says that there's even more that we haven't got records of on iNaturalist. Now, the interesting thing is the very reason this is caused is also how we can help fix it. And fixing is important conversations to have. Our environment has its own inbuilt resilience and resistance to blooms like this. It is trying now. I've seen 4 or 5 different biological feedback systems of organisms in our environment that are trying to beat it. We know that healthy connected ecosystems around the Gulf, we know that low pollution, we know that lots of seagrasses, lots of oysters, all of those things will make large blooms like this disappear quickly. We also know, unfortunately, that a stable climate is required to prevent blooms. And I guess that's the really interesting thing here. Over the last 200 years of our settlement in this state, almost 200 years, we've damaged all of these things around the edge of this circle. And the most latest developments in climate change mean that we've grabbed the centre of this circle and we've given it a good old shake. And that's why we've got bloom at the moment. And it will happen again and more often as things progress. Once again, one of Chloe's amazing diagrams. We can help the biological response to the bloom. This has a picture of sea sparkle, which you saw probably across the media. It's one of my favourite invasive dinoflagellates. It's closely related in some ways. It's another dinoflagellate. Sea sparkle doesn't have any chlorophyll at all, but it loves eating Karinia. But there are a series of other things that do. There's what research overseas is showing is that many of our seagrasses contain bacteria that actually kill planktonic algae. And so in particular, they often attack the hazardous algal bloom species. And overseas, they're extracting some of that bacteria and growing it in a laboratory to try and see if they can control blooms that way, which is far better than spreading clay everywhere, as you can imagine. But I know that there are several researchers at Flinders University who are now trying to do this as well. On a really important level, though, the original work by Heidi Alloway, and has since been followed up by a vast number of researchers, have discovered that when we first settled South Australia, 1,500 kilometres of our coast was lined with native oyster beds and reefs. We know throughout this bloom, that particular species is persisting really well. And when examined underneath a microscope, we can see that they're actually physically eating Karinia, and so is the Pacific oyster, by the way. And all of those sort of dark greeny cyan patches on that map from the Nature Conservancy show where those oyster beds used to be. Unfortunately, they're functionally extinct. Most of those, in fact, all of the native oyster reefs themselves, although we still have some individual organisms, were dredged out by the 1940s, and then we promptly forgot we ever had them, which we're really good at doing. And so groups like Ozfish and the Nature Conservancy are doing some incredible work and have been for some years now. Here's a photo of the native oyster reef at Glenelg, which is still alive, even though the algae on the outside's died back. And they believe that if we can restore 40 to 60% of those oysters, along with the seagrasses and things that surrounded them, the likelihood of these blooms will be greatly reduced. And I think, Michelle, that's what I wanted to say today.
Thank you so much. That was really fantastic, Faith. And there's a lot of fans in the list there saying that they love seeing you on the big screen. We have a lot of questions for you, but what we might do is get each of our speakers, although if you don't mind, because Faith is actually explaining some of the scientific understandings of cause and effect, I might just pose one or two questions and then we'll go through all our other speakers who are looking at different aspects of this issue, and then we can come back to all the questions if that's okay. A couple of questions in summary. So we can definitely expect more of this at the moment because the heat of the water has increased the potential for these circumstances. So definitely looking to see more of them in the future.
We're definitely likely to get more in the future for two reasons. One, because of climate change, and the other one because this one has happened. So when you get a big bloom like this, it makes the system that was impacted more unstable and more likely to have a big bloom.
Okay. And you're saying that if we were able to restore some of the coastal and intercoastal ecosystems, such as putting oyster beds back where they used to be and looking after seagrass, that might actually be a way to handle the future occurrences?
For several reasons. One is both of those ecosystems are blue carbon ecosystems, so they sequester carbon from the air. So there's a bonus right there. They also stabilise the systems and reduce the availability of nutrients in the water, and they clarify the water long term, which means it doesn't hold as much heat as it would otherwise hold. And then there's advantages of the algacidal bacteria and the filtration and eating of the blooms as they come along. So yes, they will have an impact, but we will need to at least hit that 40%, if not 60% of their natural distribution.
So perhaps in a future citizens' inquiry, we can invite economists to come and tell us what the cost would be of doing it and not doing it in terms of the restoration into the future. Someone's asked, it's linked to this, and I think we've already touched on it, but do you think this algal bloom species is here to stay?
It has been here to stay for 40 years, but it is now, so in 2013, it spread further than it previously would have, and now it is, of course, everywhere. And yeah, it's not going to disappear from our mix of species. For example, the Coorong itself has at least 16, 17 different hazardous algal species in it, and they're there permanently. But they don't permanently bloom and they don't permanently cause issues. What happens is they die back to a dull raw. Just many of us have disease cells and other bacteria within us that we live with. Our environment will live with low levels of this. But yeah, we're going to see more blooms of it, yes.
Thank you. And the final question before we go back to our speakers and then open up at the end for further questions. Can we talk just for a moment about the mixed messages people are getting about land-based marine pollution? You said that there was no Murray River signature. Can you explain that a little and talk about to what extent is pollution and nutrients in rivers causing this or contributing to this?
Okay, so there's two discussions there. One, is there any evidence that land-based pollution triggered this bloom? And the answer is no. There is no evidence that any of the land-based pollutions triggered this bloom. The only clear trigger is the marine heatwave. However, there is a clear link between land-based pollution making our environment less resilient and land-based pollution contributing to climate change and the increased turbidity making our water hold more water and all of those things. So while this didn't trigger this bloom, it is likely that our mismanagement of our landscape has made it worse and made us more vulnerable to it.
Okay. Faith Coleman, thank you so much. And we'll come back to you at the end of our discussion, but thank you so much for that important discussion. And now I'm really pleased to invite Freya to join us. Freya, if you would like to unmute, and I will do the spotlighting as we hear from your voice. Thank you so much again, Faith. Are you there, Freya?
Yes, I am, and I'm hoping that I've
Wonderful.
shared screen.
Yes, we can see your slides. So Freya Higgins-Despiolas is going to talk with us about some aspects of the economic and tourism impacts from the algal bloom. Thank you so much, Freya.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Sean, for organizing this. I'm with the University of South Australia, and I research and teach in tourism management. The first thing I'd like to say is to acknowledge the Kaurna traditional owners. A lot of my knowledge of the potential for tourism comes from pretty intensive learning experiences or even training from Ngarrindjeri and Kaurna cultural leaders. The photograph comes from April when in Middleton there was a toxic surf forum held, one of the early forums about this issue, at which Faith spoke and informed us, as she's been doing for months. And it shows the hostel, the youth hostel in the background. And so what I propose today is to think about the role of tourism and the impacts of the algal bloom on tourism and how we might think about it. See if I can advance my slides. So the first point that I want to do is rethinking tourism, because we all commonly think we know tourism and often we're very critical of it. So I know people may be thinking this isn't the most important thing we could be talking about, but I think that there's a good argument to be made that tourism's more than we give it credit for. There's been a concerted effort by the industry and by governments to think about it economically, about the jobs, the growth, the economic growth, and the infrastructures that tourism can support. But there's more to it than that. It has much greater potential if we think about it, and a lot of this happens unseen in the background. In addition to its economic value, it has both social and ecological value. And I bring this to the tribunal because I'd like us to bring this work forward as we deal with the algal bloom, about how tourism might be a tool to help us support communities and ecologies that are being impacted by this crisis. My work recently has focused on thinking about tourism by centering the local communities rather than the tourist and the tourism industry. And my proposal is, if we center local communities, because in fact, they're the places where tourism happens, they're the ones that have to live with tourism impacts. And if we bring the local community into decision-making, and we ensure that they benefit from tourism, then we can create the best outcomes from tourism's potential. So what does tourism have to do with this harmful algal bloom? It has been affecting the coastlines in South Australia, and I'll explain that in a moment about how extensive it is in affecting the coastlines. The South Australian Tourism Commission has noted that it's had a serious impact on marine life and the industries that rely on it. Particularly fishing's been concentrated upon, and agriculture, but also tourism. So the question that I'm sharing with you today through my presentation is, how can tourism activity support community recovery and long-term well-being as we face a crisis-challenged future, and particularly noting that climate change is presenting South Australia and Australia with perpetual and continual crises into the future. So we need to think about what tourism can do about the situation we're in. So what are these coastal areas that are being impacted? At one time or another, and at the current moment, different areas along the South Australian coast have been impacted. And in fact, the algal bloom is moving and changing with the changing environmental conditions. So for today, many of us here in South Australia are experiencing the storms coming across with cold fronts, and we're having some of these changes happen. But as you can see by the list here, there are extensive impacts, and it's particularly getting well noticed now that it's hit metropolitan Adelaide. Since July, I think, late June, early July is when metropolitan Adelaide beaches have been really severely impacted and concentrated the mines. So in talking about tourism and the impacts, I do want to say the Tourism Industry Council of South Australia has done a survey of operators. 97 operators had responded to that survey. The survey was done in the first half of July, and the impact on tourism has been considerable. These operators have reported reduced income. They've reported reduced forward bookings and are very concerned about the upcoming spring and summer seasons. There's been access problems, particularly for coastal and marine-based tourism operators, water quality issues and health concerns. People are reporting respiratory symptoms, either from going in the water or even being on coastal walks. The tourism industry itself and the tourism operators are very concerned about the fact that international and national media have picked up this issue, and they're worried about messaging damage into the long-term future. And particularly South Australia supports an ecotourism industry, and many of our industries are focused on the green, clean and green image that we have. There have been operational disruptions, and then there's also psychological impacts. And I know that psychology is going to be talked about by one of the speakers coming up. The industry itself is very concerned to rebuild confidence in coastal and marine destinations. So they're working on that, and I'll mention what they're doing in a moment. But first of all, I just wanted to show you, before talking about what the tourism industry of South Australia is going to do about this, is the value of tourism in South Australia, so that you can see some stats that show what I'm going to talk about, the issue of local communities being tourist in South Australia being important. When we think about tourism and we promote tourism and we see the marketing campaigns, it's often the international tourists that we think about. But in fact, from these stats, you can see the numbers are actually not the biggest contributor to tourism in the state of South Australia. So we get 451,000 visitors per year from international visitors. But if we go to domestic day trips, there's 13.3 million per year. So you can see a huge difference there. We know that day trippers don't spend as much, so that's why this emphasis on the international visitors is there. And then interstate trips per year, and this was at the close of 2024, is 4.6 million. So there's really great value in day trippers and interstate markets for South Australia. So in response, the tourism industry has done two things, and that's very recent. It's this week that they've got our Coast is Calling campaign. It's got two aspects to it. We've seen the voucher program be announced this week, and the idea is to offer vouchers that will have a dual purpose of supporting operators and at the same time sparking demand by giving a subsidy for interstate or South Australian tourists in the spring and the spring school holiday season coming up, to incentivize them to travel to impacted communities and book out with tourism operators to support them. But there will be a marketing campaign as well. And the purpose of the marketing campaign is to say the coast is open, there are experiences to be had, and to create some certainty to promote that demand. This is to help the impacted coastal communities through these campaigns. But also more interesting to my work is this idea about promoting South Australians supporting each other by taking their holidays in coastal areas in this time. The program itself is offering 20,000 vouchers, and you can apply for a lottery system to access those, which will be launched on the 24th of September. Tourism operators who fit the criteria are being invited to submit today, the deadline today, to be a part of the program. The funds are coming from the 28 million algal bloom support package, and I know that some people on this call might be upset about that because the package itself is also supporting the research and, sorry, I'm looking for my notes, the research, the community support, the information campaign. So there might be some that are upset that this is happening to support operators and to incentivize demand. I'll try to explain why that might be a good thing as I go through my next slides. Can we imagine tourism for the public good? In thinking about this incentivizing campaign, and even then forward into the future once the campaign runs, can we think about our role as South Australians, but also I know we've got interstate people on our call, inviting them into South Australia as interstate visitors to also support our communities in this. And there's form in this. It's been used from the 2019 bushfires on Kangaroo Island to have a Book Them Out campaign to create solidarity amongst South Australians when the operators on Kangaroo Island were ready for visitors to come and access tourism opportunities on the island. It's been used in the pandemic. and it's been used also with the Murray River floods more recently. I would say we need a good balance of the interest of community, business, and the environment as we respond to these catastrophes and crises that climate change and other crises that we face are causing. So we need to think about getting that balance right. So that would be my argument about how these funds are spent and allocated. Particularly, we need citizen-led decision-making and a commitment to the long-term public good as our guiding principles as we deal with this crisis. I would argue tourism may have a role in this. One of the great stories out of the algal bloom, and Faith talked about this in her presentation, is the role of the citizen scientist. Those people who were on the beaches, many of them surfers, many of them fisher people, were the ones that collected the evidence of just how bad the algal bloom was impacting our marine environment by documenting through iNaturalist the kills and the death of the species. This can actually be a form of tourism. We have skills amongst potential tourists and travelers that when they go on to holidays in coastal areas that could be used to support communities facing this crisis. So citizen scientists, our divers, could be helping with data collection, or they could be helping with the restoration work that Faith's presentation also talked about. So these are some of the great things that tourists could support in their holidays. We have forms of ecotourism and regenerative tourism, which are about ecological and holistic ways of using tourism for the benefit of societies and the communities. We could have Indigenous tourism or First Nations tourism, offer insights into the long-term histories of places, the cultural stories of places, and about the need for care and custodianship, which is really what we need going forward into the future. And then I wouldn't want to neglect the fact that school groups and sporting clubs can be part of this feature as well. So that's part of what I was saying about the beginning of thinking about tourism in a more wide scope value than just the focus on the commercial side of things or the international tourist market. And then lastly, I'm hoping that we'll spark community festivals that might bring visitors and communities together to share love and caring together and to help us navigate this crisis in a way that we take care of each other. But acknowledging the context, I swim with a group of women, and when I've talked with them about tourism in this context, I was reminded that we are in grief and that communities are clearly suffering. So in promoting holidays to coastal areas, we have to recognize, if we promote tourism, the grief and the pain that communities are suffering. And communities are clearly very concerned with what the next summer season will be. And Faith's alert in her talk actually is a concern, because it's not looking like this next summer up to autumn is actually going to be a resolution to this problem. So this grief is going to be something that's going to be very serious. Can we make alliances together to cope with the situation that we're in and use tourism as a vehicle to take care of each other, bring some income into these challenged communities, support the tourism operators? And many of these operators are small family-owned businesses that are members of our community. And when we visit, can we stay longer, and can we ensure that our money actually trickles through that economy by buying in the shops, because that's part of tourism, buying the petrol in the local area, going to the pubs, going to the bakeries, going into the farmers markets and spending our money in the economies, because this is what will help sustain communities in the face of this crisis. And then I note that climate change is going to be an ongoing issue. It's the root of the crisis with the pandemic, it's the root of the bushfires, and now it's the root of the algal bloom. And so my call would be, let's use tourism as a tool in our toolkit to create more resilient communities and create solidarity in our communities together, so that we can navigate this difficult future that we face together and with positivity. That's it for me. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Freya, for those valuable perspectives. We have a number of questions which we'll come back to in the question time. But in summary, some of them are about the health impacts, and is it wise to be encouraging tourism if people don't understand the health impacts, so we'll come back to that, and then other questions that are all linked together around funding support. Where should the priority for funding be going? But we'll come back to that. I just wanted to flag with you, Freya. Thank you so much. Moving along, I'm now going to invite Steve to join us. Steve's going to share perspectives from his work and life. Over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Okie doke. Look, I just thought people may not actually know too much about Stansbury, so I thought I'd start with a bit of an introduction of who we are and what we do, and then we'll talk more about the impact of the bloom on our business and then these broader effects, and we've heard some of those already. But I guess the first thing is who we are. So we're just a family business. My wife and I have been growing oysters on York Peninsula for 19 years, and there are really three streams to our business. Oysters grown in Stansbury are often sent to other oyster growing areas, so we do a lot of what we call on-grown, which is sending juvenile oysters into more productive oyster growing areas. We also do a number of wholesale sales with a number of restaurants, pubs we supply, and caterers and whatever else. And we also have a tourism business which we've added to our operation over the last few years, which has been quite lucrative. So people may or may not know where Stansbury is. So this is a bit of a map of South Australia, and we're in York Peninsula, about halfway down. So we're actually almost opposite on the western side of Gulf St Vincent, right opposite Adelaide. This is a little map of the Stansbury growing area, the harvest area, and you can see all the oyster leases there shaded in the sort of the grey. All the oyster leases exist on a spit, which is imaginatively called the South Spit because it's the one that's the most southern in the Gulf St Vincent. There's another one at Port Vincent. There's another one at She Oak Flat. So this is the South Spit, and you can see on there where we are about 4 or 5 k's out is our main grow-out area. Interestingly enough, I've also included the red arrow is simply the prevailing wind of where it comes from. So you can see that it's the currents that the wind whips up in the Gulf that bring the nutrients to us and take away the waste on the tide. Just some very quick metrics about oyster farming in Stansbury. There's been oyster farming of one sort or another in Stansbury since the 1850s, so that's quite a long time ago, and that was really an accident of geography. The native oyster beds, which we've heard Faith mention today, is where the industry started, and that was, as Faith mentioned, fished out, commercially fished out anyway by the 1920s, I think. And then the introduction of the Pacific oyster, which is a native of Japan, gave the industry a new lease on life in Stansbury in probably the 1960s to current times. So there are currently 6 growers in Stansbury, and there is also growers at down on Kangaroo Island at Port Vincent, Coon, and Kabowie, Edithburgh. As a size of the industry, just to give people a sense, we've probably got within Stansbury 10 million in the water at any point in time. So it's an intertidal business that we have. Some others down at KI are subtidal, so they're always in the water, but you can see from that photo that we tend to work only when our leases are exposed. It's very much it's a hands-on industry, and we currently have around 1 million oysters in the water out there. I thought I might mention that it takes 3 years in our water to grow oysters to market size. And I've included this screen, these photos, because I thought it might be useful. People may not understand how oysters are grown. We actually buy the spat from specialist hatcheries. There's one at Port Lincoln, there's one at Cowell. And so we buy them as 3 to 5 mil typically, and you can see the size of them there. They're fully formed and ready to go. And then over the next 3 years, we simply grow them out, and we're grading them every 20 weeks or so, increasing the size of the baskets to improve the water flow and reducing the numbers per bag. So that's the game. Turning now to the impact of the bloom on our business, we've been closed currently for 117 days. That's not to say that the oysters are dying. They're not. They're very healthy. But we cannot sell, give away or move our oysters. What that means is that we've cancelled our tourism operation, which is obviously based around the in-water activities and obviously involved a lot of consuming of our oysters. So for the last 117 days, our revenues dropped to zero, which is a bit concerning. And just for people to understand that the water is still dirty and it still smells here. And whenever I go out in the water, I certainly get a sore throat and running eyes. So I've changed the way that I go out now. If there's any sort of wind, I don't, or swell, I don't go. So as I say, oysters are healthy and happy. So what's the impact been in our environment? Everything is dead. There is nothing left in the water. It is a desert out there. And I've included this photo because this is actually of the fires that went through York Peninsula around Easberg in 2019. So it still looks okay out there, but like the fire, so the fences are still there, the trees are still there, but clearly there's something not right. And so that the analogy to bushfires, I think, is particularly pertinent. Here's just this now a series of photos. So this is on the left is before the bloom and on the right is after the bloom or during the bloom. And you can see that the water is very clear on the left, and that's a fiddler ray that we call them dogs of the sea. They swim around your feet and you can pick them up and give them a pet and put them back in and those sorts of things. There's a picture of my wife doing exactly that with that fiddler ray from the previous slide. Unfortunately, those things are long gone. So when we harvest now, we would typically get in a boatload of, as you can see there from that photo, we would get the whole bottom of the boat would be swimming with shrimp and little fish and blue-ringed docky and those sorts of things. Unfortunately, there's nothing like that now. So from my perspective, the entire food web has been disrupted. And a lot of the other larger animals are not behaving normally. Certainly the birds, everyone's a bit confused. The seals are confused. They would normally swim up and down the margins of the deep and the shallow water on the spit and feed. And right now they're in at the boat ramp going, what the hell's going on? What are we supposed to be doing? That's just a photo of, we did get a lot of blue-ringed docky on our leases. Back to the impact, this is what it used to look like, and this is what it looks like now. So this is weed, rafts of seaweed. In fact, we're not sure what it is. No one can tell us quite what this weed is, but you can see we believe that this weed has died as a result of the algal bloom. Our sense is that we think it's the root structure of larger weed species in the water. Typically, there's a seasonal die-off of these weed species. They're the ribbon and tape weeds, the stuff that ends up over on West Beach, and the councils come along with their front-end loaders and get rid of it all. But we think what we're seeing, this really filamentous weed, is probably the root structure of weed species that have now died, and I have questions about whether we're going to lose the sand, what the long-term effects of this sort of die-off is going to be. Turning now more broadly to wider community impacts, and we've heard Freya talk about tourism, and that is certainly in our neck of the woods. The permanent population of Stansbury is probably 500, and I reckon during the school holidays and Christmas and Easter and those things, it probably swells to 5,000, maybe not that high, but certainly several thousand people. So what we're seeing is with this bloom is that people aren't coming here anymore for the water activities. So there is an enormous multiplier effect, as not just on the oyster industry, but on accommodation providers and the hotel and those sorts of things. So lots of jobs are being lost. And what happens when jobs are lost in regional communities, families move and those skills are lost. And in the event that eventually the bloom disappears or we do get some sort of tourism industry back or some other sort of industry, regrettably that we then can't staff it because the skills have been lost, families have moved away. And so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, unfortunately. This is an example of, this is the boat ramp at Stansbury last Sunday. And other than a couple of buffy oyster boats that are out, one of which was mine, it's empty. Now, you might be thinking, that is a big car park. That is the size of a Westfield shopping centre. And it is, and let me tell you, during school holidays and Christmas and Easter, that is full. You cannot get a park in that car park. And it probably has room for, I don't know, a couple of hundred boats, I guess. This is the caravan park, 2 caravan parks in town, both of which are community owned and operated by the local Progress Association. And those profits go back to the community. The Progress Association makes grants to local community sports clubs or whatever. And you can see there, so let me say, this is a legacy caravan park. You have to have, this is generational. You cannot get a spot in these caravan parks. There's a waiting list of years. And I reckon if you look at that photo, there might be 3 caravans in there. So that's not good. That's the jetty. We've talked about Freya talked about the economic impacts. I think this is a slide from the same presentation that they had. This is just talking about the value of tourism to Yorke Peninsula. And so $358 million is certainly a lot of money to be taken out of the Yorke Peninsula community. This to me really represents what oyster growing is in Stansbury. And this is a few years ago now, but visit by the local primary school, then this represents a lot happier times. I look back at this photo with a lot of love in my heart from terrific people that we've let go, terrific people that are still in the community but are suffering badly as a result of this algal bloom. So where to from here? This is just, so the government has been measuring both the brevetoxin level, which is what the problem is with our oysters. It's not so much the Mickey Motoi or the algae. In fact, they love it. They're eating it like stink. But so this is just me. I've done this, just maps out, or a bit of a time series of what's happening with both the algal species in the water and the brevetoxin. So the dark line is the brevetoxin level. And the one very close to there is a dark line at almost on the 0, which is that's Food Safety Australia and New Zealand, is the threshold for brevetoxin. And you can see there's quite a gap. So we're currently at 15 times the threshold level. So what that says to me is that we aren't going anywhere soon. We've been closed for 117 days and it's still continue for quite some time. So, as we've heard from Faith, we don't know the cause of this bloody thing. We need to find out where the smoking gun is. It's never been seen in Australia before. The size of this bloom is unprecedented almost anywhere in the world. 4,500 square kilometres. Something's got to be feeding it. Where's that coming from? We need to actually do some basic science and research. So to that end, by the recovery time. So that's what I'm more concerned about now. We've been closed for 117 days. Will we ever be able to open? And what will be the impact or the residual toxicity? Because this is uncharted, we've never seen this before. The stuff from the small amount of information that's available internationally suggests that the clearance rates for the toxin out of the oysters can be anything from 6 days to 6 months. So we're really no closer to understanding where any of this is going. What are we doing? we've already heard about, and I would commend to everyone listening that we need to build our experience with citizen science. We're getting into collecting some base data. We're trying to collaborate with researchers to support the next generation of scientists. We get PhD students that come over because we're the closest sort of commercial oyster area to Adelaide. We get a lot of visitors over here. And we're trying to build resilience in the marine environment. The reef restoration stuff that we've talked about, oysters are the kidneys of the ocean. They will clean up a lot of pollution very quickly. Not surprisingly, China would be the largest oyster producer in the world, but their water's extremely polluted, so they have very big oysters, very large, very fat, lovely oysters, but you wouldn't eat them raw. So all of their production goes to oyster sauce and fish sauce and those sorts of things.
Steve, thank you so much. And I just want to share with you, a lot of people have put comments in there expressing their deep sorrow about what you, your family, your business and your community are going through. We all feel for you, and we're really grateful that you've shared your time and your thoughts with us. Honestly, there's been a lot of people saying they're actually crying, that your slides have been very powerful, reminding them of the devastation that's been caused. So, Steve, our hearts go out to you and your family, and truly, please feel a moment of solidarity with people like us who don't know you, but we care a great deal, and we're truly sorry about what's been happening to you and your community, as well as everyone I know. But I really feel it when you can share those slides and those stories. And 117 days closed, it's pretty devastating. Steve, what we'll do at the end is we'll come back to some of your questions about the science, and I might actually put some of those questions to Faith so that perhaps you and she can talk about where things are up to with where industry and scientists are working together, where they could perhaps collaborate more strongly. But we might come to that at the end. So thank you, Steve, and to everyone who's just really feeling it. Sean and I, as we were organising this over the last couple of months, we just wanted to say, hang in there. This is not easy stuff to listen to. If you're directly affected, it's devastating. Even those of us who are not living there are watching in daily horror. So we just want to say, without being dramatic, hang in there. You're not alone. People do care. And I think if we can continue to join together and keep talking about the solutions and then making those solutions happen, and also handle the stuff that we can't change or alter, then yeah, I guess I'm just trying to offer some support. And that's why we host these citizens processes, so that you don't feel that you're all alone. On that note, it might be really good to turn to our next speaker, Sophia, who is a psychologist who practices in the space of eco-grief and eco-anxiety. And again, thank you, Steve. We'll come back to you. Don't go anywhere. And over to you, Sophia. Thank you for joining us today.
So I'm Sophia, and I work and practice on Kaurna country, as well as listening to a lot of individuals. I've been working day and night to look at what research has to say about what some of the impacts on our well-being, how this situation may be creating vulnerability within the broader community, and what can be done about this at a community-based level. And I will say at the outset, thank you so much, Steve, for raising so many issues, and I will touch on some of that stuff. I can't pretend I will not be doing justice to those community groups and the well-being issues in the industry affected communities, nor with First Nations people, nor with youth and some of the communities particularly closely impacted. Talking today at some of the really broad impacts, and looking in particular at a lot of us are feeling a lot of distress, and at a community level there are a whole range of reasons why this situation will be affecting our well-being, our distress, our sense of coping. First of all, for South Australians, a large proportion of us are connected through livelihoods or lifestyles to the coast. This is an ongoing challenge, as many speakers have spoken to. We're repeatedly exposed, either through our work or through experiences and images of distressing scenes, And for a lot of us in the community, it is really hard to escape. It's not as simple as some public advice to just switch off your screens to escape this stuff. And as people like Steve speaks to, many of us are hit on many fronts, from the health impacts to the distressing scenes, to the financial impacts, as well as, importantly, to our normal recreational activities that offer is a buffer to mental health issues. Many of us are still feeling quite helpless, reading some of the comments as to what to do. People like Steve are great at speaking to some of the ways we can support industries or environment. And for many of us, there's clearly that strong link to climate change that we can't help but think of that when we think of this situation, and the general uncertainty that all of that brings. So this is really just a visual way, and also based on what research says, will be creating vulnerability in us, and for us to just take that time to gauge the enormity of all the reasons this impact, when of course there's many that I've missed. And with all this, it's really normal to be feeling a range of big and often changing feelings about it. Obviously, the grief and sadness, the anger and frustration, I noticed that coming through on some of the feeds, the fear and worry and so on. And as part of this, it's also normal to have mixed emotions. Many of us in the community, despite all these difficult parts, I've been talking to people who are expressing light in the dark, in the sense of some positive emotions too. People are noticing more people having greater appreciation and awe at nature, more curiosity in science. Some people are experiencing more sense of community, care and compassion, sense of purpose. So it's really to just put this in a big perspective. And in that big perspective, a lot of us are experiencing quite complex emotions and thoughts related to climate change. And while there's a whole lot on this, one of the things that we can often talk about is something called solastalgia. And solastalgia is really trying to describe the distress and the loss of distractions to our natural or home place. And of course, this is something not dissimilar to what First Nations people will have been describing in different ways over an extended period. But for the broader community, this is becoming a more frequent experience. One way of talking about this is a sense of loss without edges. At the moment, we don't know the extent of the destruction, and we don't know how long it will go on. And unlike other losses, we don't know the parameters. It's just and this is quite common to be talked about in the climate literature. And in a way, we can have something what I call calculation distress, that constant needing to guesstimate how vast and full on is the destruction and the other negative impacts of the situation. So with all of this, we know from research that a large proportion of us, despite these distressing emotions, will gradually find ways to more or less function and find ways through. A significant minority, and it's incredibly hard to estimate this, and I'm talking at a broad scale level, but the eco-literature on impacts of ecological disaster will indicate that there can be an increase of between 5 and 20% increase in the current prevalence. That means in the current rates of people experiencing a new mental health condition. And one study that I literally came out last week is saying that in Europe, because of the fires and the heat waves, 15% in some countries are experiencing what we'd say is clinically significant levels of eco-anxiety. And assuming that this bloom continues over the summer, we really could be seeing similar increases in the population. That's my feeling on it. So with all of this, what can we do to sustain ourselves and protect our well-being? One way that we can think of this sometimes is to look at a broad level and think of the different areas that we can potentially adjust, tweak, or try some new areas of coping from within us as individuals, what we're doing with our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions, as well as how we're drawing upon our relationships, our social and community engagement, and our society and citizenship participation to buffer, one, to be doing the things that need to be done, and also to buffer our own mental health and well-being. And one particular thing that's really important to think about when we think of climate-related emotions, where there's no obvious or quick fix solutions, many of us tend to go to information seeking. Many of us want to know what we can do to help. Some of us can put less emphasis on what we do to process all these strong emotions. So this is really just to make a plug for a time like this where there's ongoing high level emotions, that we really can do well to place more emphasis on being with those feelings, accepting that we're having them, naming it to tame it, as I call it, and allowing ourselves to feel these. A colleague the other day talked about an Indigenous perspective. I think it was from Native Americans. I can't be sure on this, but really a wonderful way of thinking about feeling is that they say, when the tears, let them yourself feel them on your cheek, let them run down past on your skin, drop off your chin, and land on your heart, so that you may know the full extent of your grief. And this is really just a way to saying to be with those feelings. Some of us may be able to do that by talking with people. That's often more tricky than some of the public information coming out. And I've got some other information on that I'll refer to later. But taking time in nature, journaling, etc., etc. Another type of way of coping that's common in the eco-literature is what we call meaning making. It's really about thinking, how do we bring together perhaps our feelings, our passions for things, our thoughts on things, actions, perhaps at an individual level or a society level, to go beyond the problem. Of course, we can't go beyond the algal bloom, but we can say, is there some light in the dark? Is there some aspect that we can make new meaning? And I think one of these that I invite is for people to look at, what new roles can we take on? What new identities as individuals can we take on? What are there new possibilities for social connections? Are there lessons learned as an individual or society? How can we think outside the box and focus on the fact that we're generating some creative solutions, whether it's in tourism and so on? How can we work as teamwork? And it's really a plug to say, to assign ourselves with a constructive role. This is just a very brief thing of a guy who's just decided to post every few days a comedy thing. And this is really just a way in which he's keeping the morale going in the public. He's assigned himself that role. And no matter how, I'm a single, very busy mum. I've been working day and night in this, time poor, energy poor, etc. Many of us are financially poor. But there are ways that we can contribute in a way that matters and helps. We've heard some ways that we can get involved in community engagement. And I've just this morning launched I don't know what it is, a blog about a whole range of different ways of participating as citizens and so on. But on that day-to-day level, post a poem or a song, educate others, be the empath, be the safe space police, as I call it, which means really call out the judgmentalism online. People are reporting their health concerns and other people are dismissing them. And this is really important, that people can have a voice. So even if your role is that, be the assistant sandwich maker for the people doing the coastal care days or the coastal cleanups, or I've been dragging myself along to revegetation projects, even though I didn't think I had energy, but they turned out to give me more energy. These are just some very brief ideas and strategies. And Yeah, so when we want to think about coping, some general take-home strategies, I would say is we need a multi-pronged approach at the moment. We need more than one strategy. It may be different ones at different times. Last week, I had to stop and turn off my computer. I saw pictures of the baby whales come in, and the whole enormity of the whole situation hit me, and I just needed to give myself time to cry. The weeks before, I had to readapt where I go for my walks, because it used to be in the blue spaces. Now I've got to carve out green spaces. These are just from the personal perspective. Try more emotion-focused strategies, try more meaning-making strategies, try more community participation, and look for balance between looking after yourself and the environment and the community, between getting right away from the problem and doing something actively to cope, looking at the sad, hard parts and finding any positives that can be in the situation. And just at the bottom here, mostly in response to the fact that, without getting political right now, the perhaps lack of provision of recognition of the emotions and the strategies related to that. We're setting up different programs, and we hope there'll be more funding through the government. But anyway, we've developed a site, Algal Bloom wellbeingresources.org, that anyone can go on and access. It's brand new. There's probably spelling mistakes. We welcome feedback or ideas so that we can respond and start to collate some information and be appalled, particularly related to the mental health issues.
And Sophia, that algal bloom wellbeingresources.org, is that your website? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, yes.
Sophia, thank you so much for both your heartfelt talk and also the broader ideas around how people are struggling and how some are coping in many different ways. So definitely, please, everybody, you're not alone, but everyone does cope differently. So do be patient. If some people want to jump up and get active and get urgent and fight, and others want to curl up in a fetal ball and cry, let's be patient with each other and support each other in whatever mode we're in. So I'm sure most people go through many of them. But Sophia, thank you so much for your time. I'm now going to invite our final speaker, Richard, to come and join us. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to be very brief. I deliberately didn't prepare a presentation because I realized beforehand the extraordinary expertise and knowledge of the other speakers. And so I live overseas. I'm in Thailand. I do have a daughter in South Australia, so I'm hearing about the bloom a lot, but I feel very much like an interloper. And I'd rather look at this multidimensional problem in the here and now in terms of there not being a single panacea solution. I do eat the oysters we have in Thailand, Steve, but they're large and fat and tasteless in comparison with yours. The description of the science from Faith was extraordinary. I learned so much listening to you, so thank you for that. Sophia, absolutely the incredible impact this is having psychologically on people. And in terms of the tourism industry, of course, for understanding the dimensions of that was very useful. So my focus is on not what can we do to solve the problem, because obviously there are things that can be done, but I look at the issue in terms of an expanded now, not the here and now of the problem, but the expanded now. How on earth did it come to this? What decisions did we make in the past? What have we done? How have we made choices in the past that have led to this? What is the actual understanding of that in the present moment? And what can we do to prevent this kind of thing happening in the future? Because there are 4 issues that I'd like to emphasize, and these are not mine. These have come from the other speakers. But I'd like us to end on one dimension of hope, because I think that's extremely important for our sanity. So there are 4 things. This crisis is a wake-up call. It's a sign from the future that we actually need to pay attention to. The bloom isn't just one event. It's a sign of bigger problems, and we euphemistically talk about climate change, but there are a whole range of dimensions within that in terms of the extinction of species, the changes to the ocean damage, the loss of biodiversity, and also, of course, the things we feel like heat. So a weak signal today could amplify very easily into much bigger threats tomorrow. So this algal bloom highlights for me the fragilities in Australia, South Australia's coastal economies. The opportunities is to imagine a future where our coasts are much more resilient, self-healing ecosystems, perhaps monitored by AI, which is a very useful way of doing it, and powered by community data. This whole notion of citizen science, very important indeed. The shift we can make there is, instead of focusing on fixing the past and constantly patching up the present, which is what governments tend to do, we can actually design systems from now on that grow stronger, more resilient through these challenges. In other words, they're regenerative. They heal themselves. We use the crisis as a catalyst for real innovation. So that's one thought I had when listening to the other speakers. The second issue that's come across very clearly is that we need to create a new narrative, a living coast narrative, where people understand that everything is connected. The bloom is not just an ecological problem. As we've heard with Sophia, for example, it's incredibly impactful on our psychology and our emotions, our relationships. We heard from Steve, to be closed, the business closed for 170 days is absolutely devastating. And how we can use ecotourism, it's clear from the ideas that Freya had that there are things we can do to create a new narrative of a living coast, a new way of thinking about how we use and treat the coasts as living, intelligent systems with rights. They have rights. Unfortunately, we've put humanity at the center of everything we do, and everything else is a resource to be used. Absolutely no. That's not the way of thinking about the future if we're going to avoid these kinds of crises in the future. The third idea I had is around innovation. And there is a product from, I think it's MCAM in the US, called the Global Innovation Commons. This is a whole catalogue of innovative ideas that are out of patent and can be used, many of them free, without any cost at all, to actually help alleviate and solve the problems. We can build citizen foresight laboratories. We can open spaces where people can share knowledge, share tools, and share technologies to solve the really big problems together facing us. So I think that's very important, that we need to empower communities with different kinds of innovation and not really rely on top-down deliberations by government, but the bottom-up genius of community intelligence. Let locals and indigenous knowledge, particularly, combined with smartphone apps to report blooms, to help design policies along experts. So the innovation commons, using the genius of bottom-up knowledge, I think, is very important and very relevant for us. And finally, the final issue that Sophia obviously is an expert on is in community support, because the bloom, again, isn't just about the environment. It's about the emotional and economic toll on people. We need to imagine regenerative narratives for thriving ecotourism, jobs in green and blue technology, blue health particularly initiatives, and coasts that actually boost mental health and keep us healthier than we would be normally. We need a new story about healing and forgiveness of the past and how we make sense of what we're going through today and lead to a better future, especially for young people, because there's a kind, all around the world, there's a kind of angst hanging heavily in the air. And the way that's the negative way it's impacting young people is really incredible. I've got 9 children and 16 grandchildren, so I feel this very personally, that we need to allow youth to step into the space with us and help us determine what kind of future they want. Because if we don't allow them that, and if we continue the ways we're living at the moment and the choices we've made in the past, the industrial processes, the large-scale industrial systems, we'll simply go on creating what we've got today. So from what I've heard, I've been immensely buoyed by what I've heard. This inquiry can help shape the future, and all these ideas matter. This inquiry, Michelle, I think, sitting here in Thailand and saying this, it can become the start of a futures manifesto for life in Australia and South Australia, and also answer or help to answer the question, in today's environment, in today's world, what does it mean to be human? Because that's the real question at the hub of everything. I think together we can turn this crisis into a legacy of hope and resilience. So while the present clearly weighs heavily on our minds, the future is totally in our hands. So I wanted to thank everybody for allowing me just to voice those few thoughts, and thank you for allowing me to be present.
Thank you so much, Richard. Very powerful words and an excellent summary of the different contributions our speakers and our contributors have shared. I do want to bring Sean on too. Sean, if you can turn your video on, I want to spotlight you so that you're here as part of this panel. Oh, there you are. But thank you very much, Richard. We appreciate and your humility in coming in to share, as a futurist, your ideas about the ways we can reframe some of these issues that we're facing. Okay, so look, we've only technically got 5 minutes left. I'm going to allow at least 10 or 15, and I've been grouping people's questions together so that we can try to at least cover some of the general topics, if that's okay. There's a couple of questions around the science of what's happening, some different views on the health, and some questions about the health impacts for human beings, a little bit about funding and resources for coping, and the funding and the subsidies. The first question I'd actually like to really hone in on, in Steve's presentation, he mentioned that we still don't know enough about the causes of the crisis. But Steve, I wonder if we could ask Faith to comment on the level of confidence the scientific community has about the causes and the understanding of what's actually going on.
Some of us are more comfortable with uncertainty than others, but generally we know enough about this group of dinoflagellates to know what they're like, and we know enough about the impacts of climate change to know that has played a significant role. Whether there are other influences on that, we don't have the science for that, and we probably never will, because the system is so complicated. And so there's a series of conversations. From Steve's perspective as well, I suspect he's concerned about the brevetoxins, and we definitely don't have anywhere near the data that we need around the algal species that are present, because we've done this amazing thing that academics do where we divide things into 1,000,001 species that we know very little about, and then we don't know anything about them, which kind of sucks, and we study them in a laboratory and then they behave differently in the environment. And so I suspect there is a whole world of research that needs to be done in there, and that's going to take us another 5 to 10 years. We may never be able to answer those questions that Steve has there.
Okay. But to recap, Faith, for someone like myself who needs to clutch onto the kinds of hopefulness perhaps that Richard alluded to, would it be fair to say that certainly our oysters are suddenly not just Steve's best friend, but our best friend, and thinking about those nature-based solutions and restoring more health to the coastal areas will give us more resilience? Is that at least one good takeaway that people can hang on to?
That is the major one, and I think that's something that we've been working on for decades and have known for decades, and this is one of those things, you should never waste a good disaster, and we really have to take advantage of this one to find a way of transforming the way we relate to our marine zone.
Thank you, Faith. Steve, I don't know if you had any further questions or comments for Faith before I move into some other questions.
Thank you. You're absolutely right, Faith. Of course, it is the brevetoxin that I'm concerned about. Yeah, the algae is a friend to the oysters. They love eating it, and it is about we still don't know what is causing that brevetoxin. And none of the traditional causes of brevetoxin, the Mickey Mouse, the other Karenia species, have not been found in this bloom. So we still don't know where the brevetoxins come from. And that's that smoking gun that I'm looking for. Maybe it's out of ballast water or the bottom of a ship or something like that. We simply don't know, and we need to find out.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, and I hate to skip over a lot of complex issues, but can we turn to human health just for a moment? And this could be a question both for Faith and Freya and Steve, or anyone who wants to comment. We've had a range of questions asking about, number one, if tourism is trying to promote people going back to the coast and back to the oceans, but others are frightened of what's happening, could someone or several of you provide some comments on how safe or not safe is it for human beings to be in various places in the water, at the coast? Faith, perhaps we could start with you, but then turn to others.
Okay, so human health is not really my thing, but what we do know from what we're seeing is that as long as you're not eating brevetoxin contaminated shellfish, that the impacts of the bloom are short-lived as long as you stop exposing yourself, for most people. And so there's a whole heap of riders on that, isn't there? So what we do know is if that you are a sensitive individual, I am a sensitive individual, and you go down to the coast and you get symptoms, then the best way of dealing with it is leaving, and then the impacts will cease and you will get better. However, that's not an option for everyone, and that is an ongoing issue of concern. And Perry and I have worked quite extensively with impacted community members to find ways that we can make houses more appropriate and so forth. But yeah, it's a concern for all of us.
Thank you, Faith. Steve.
You're right. Look, the caring for the communities or caring for the coast or whatever it is a very important strategy, but it's a recovery strategy, and I've tried through my presentation to let people know we're still in the acute phase of this. So the analogy would be we're trying to rebuild the fences around the paddock whilst the bushfire is still burning out of control. So there are a lot of these things that the government's coming up with that are recovery strategies, but it's still far too early.
Thanks for that perspective, Steve. Freya, did you want to comment on with your work looking at tourism, the assurities that government are giving people that it's safe to go back, and here is a voucher? How are people responding to that? Is that something people agree with?
I don't know how people are responding, because that's literally just happened in the last few days that the South Australian government is doing the voucher scheme. I have to say, I live on the beach. I'm at North Haven living on the beach. I am impacted myself. I walk and I swim, and I am still swimming, following the government advice that you look whether the water is visibly contaminated. But when I say this idea of solidarity through tourism and interstate tourism, I want to emphasize the fact that we have holidays in these communities that don't have to be on the beach, on the water, or on the coastline, that you can experience things on the sports fields of these communities or enjoying the wineries and the farmers markets. So I'm not encouraging, and I don't think the government's encouraging anybody to risk their health or their well-being. And people need to be aware, look at the updates, because there are updates about impacted waters, and educate themselves and familiarize themselves. I have to trust the government advice, which Faith mentioned, that is, if you are impacted, move away, that it's short term, and there's specific advice of washing yourself very carefully if you do go in the waters. So we have to also be in governance of ourselves to make decisions for our own well-being, and to also be well informed. So I'd encourage everybody to be well informed. But as I've said, there's a lot of things to enjoy in communities that doesn't necessarily have to be coastal based. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think that ties back perfectly to what Steve was talking about in terms of the impacts on communities and supporting each other this is a classic localization and new economy strategy, which is think about where you're spending your dollars. And if there's a way you can support communities who are struggling, then definitely do that. Terrific. I might just ask one question to all of you. And again, you're the experts, not myself, but this mention of $28 million as an initial support for what's going on. Can anyone comment on whether they feel that money is going in the right direction? Should we be excited about that support package, or is it perhaps not aimed in the right places? If anyone can comment.
Can I just say one thing here? My instinct always is I'm a strategist, effectively, rather than a futurist. I'm an accidental futurist. But as a strategist, I work with people all around the world, and particularly right across the Asian region, in Africa and South America, particularly, so right across the global south. Generally speaking, the lazy solution is to throw money at a problem. And if that's avoiding real research and real understanding of what's going on, then it's not a good idea.
Yeah, there's just been a lot of comments in the chat about people feeling certain focus areas aren't the priority at the moment. And perhaps I think Steve said it best, which is you're still in the acute phase. We're still trying to work out what's going on and how to survive it, rather than particular strategies for recovery just yet. So,
Michelle, I'd
however,
like to comment and just say that it's not enough. It's definitely not enough funding. And we need the federal government to come to the table. There's a push to get a redefinition of disasters. And the particular focus from what I'm hearing from scientists like Faith and Anita Thomas are the long-term funds with a long-term view for the restoration and ecological restoration work that's needed. So I think we really need to push that and hammer governments on the fact that they're very short-term focused.
Yes,
Can I
Sophia.
comment about
Thank you,
the-
Freya. Hang on, Steve. We'll go to Sophia and then come back to you. Thank you.
Yeah, on Freya's note of being very short-term focused, I'm actually astounded at how little's been earmarked for mental health or the provision of that. Because if mental health were addressed at a community-based level, number one, of course, we all know the health system's already overloaded and there will be a fall-on effect. So there's increased economics at the other end. But on top of that, if more can be done at a community level, the mental health, the community well-being, and citizens' ability to engage with environmental activism, political activism can be all increased. And there's ways of doing all of that through community-based programs with multi-pronged, that's cost effective, and all the knowledge is there. And I'm just astounded with the little provision and foresight planning, because from my perspective, none of the psychologists in the areas have any availability. And I don't mean to say to people, definitely they should speak to their doctors and definitely find provision, but it's going to be extremely important that as far as the planning and preparation, and also these can be models for a new normal, because there's fires, there's many other things that are part of the ongoing rolling ecological climate related issues.
I was just going to say commenting about the 28 million. It is a token, it is not enough, but it's a start and it's an acknowledgement, and that something needs to be done. Regrettably, it doesn't, from where I'm sitting in Stansbury, it doesn't seem to be getting down to those towns, communities, businesses that are most affected. There are processes in place, and the state government has said they're going to be flexible with those processes, but these things do take time. I appreciate that, but 117 days in, and we don't seem to be getting a whole lot of benefit of that $28 million on the ground. Thank you.
So sorry to hear that, but thank you for sharing, Steve. Really appreciate your input. So look, we'll start to wrap up now. In a moment, I'm going to turn back to Sean for a concluding poll, and we'd really love it if we could have another try at filling out some perspectives at the end of all of these talks. But just before we do, and I know there's nothing worse than sum up everything in one sentence, but perhaps we could just, as a farewell from each speaker, if you could just mention what you would like to see from your perspective go to the top of the pile when everybody starts to write their submissions into our citizens' inquiry so we can share it with others. Can we just go around the speakers in the order that you spoke and just perhaps mention one or two of the key points you'd like people to think about? Faith, I'm assuming we should all become new lovers of oysters in a way we've never known before, but what are your parting words and your parting advice?
I'm hoping we rebuild a marine zone that is indeed full of oysters and seagrass.
Perfect. Thank you, Faith. And Freya, what would be your suggestion to folks as you say farewell for the day?
It's not going to be tourism, it's climate change, and to hold the government to account for its fossil fuel dependency.
Thank you, Freya. Steve?
I'd like to take a leaf out of Richard's book, and that's hope. And again, it's thinking of what Sophia said in relation to the steps of grieving which we go through. And I've been through all 7 of them. I reckon there were 7, Sophia, I'm not quite sure now. But the one I'm left with, and it's fantastic to hear Richard talk about hope. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Steve. Sophia?
Yeah, I just think everyone's talks give a broad coverage, and just in seeing some of the comments, noticing that people listening to this are feeling empowered, and there a lot of action is being taken, and I do recognize that in my talking to that sense of helplessness. I'm describing what I've been hearing from people as far as when people are struggling to know how best to allocate themselves. I'm also acknowledging that there are many people who have risen to all sorts of really important causes in this, and seeing that action and hearing people's empowerment in this, or using their rage in productive ways, I think is also a positive thing, and it's to acknowledge that is very much happening in the community at the same time.
Thank you, Sophia. And we'll be very keen to share Sophia's resources and any other materials we can on the website, which again, tribunal.org.au. We're going to make sure there's a special page there that we can at least put you in touch with a reference list of who to reach out to if you need support, or Sophia's new website. Richard, I'm not sure if you have anything to add after your fantastic 4-point summary.
Oh, I don't.
You just want to...
Yes, I do. Because, thank you, Steve, but hope is not a strategy. The strategy needs to come from community activism. Community activism is so important as a counter to the constantly patching up of the present by governments everywhere around the world. We cannot rely on governments. We have to rely on ourselves. And I would end with Freya's point. The whole issue of why we're here today talking about this is what I call the paradigm of industrial economism, which is the whole way we've allowed the fossil fuel industry to dominate everything, and predatory capitalism to help it in the partner in crime. We have to change those things, and that will not come through government. That will change only through communities.
Thank you so much. And look, I'm just going to plug again, tribunal.org.au. You've heard some of these views. You've got your own views. Please get on our website. Try to get on there and share some of your ideas before the end of Tuesday, this coming Tuesday. And your submissions will then be included in what we send off to the government's Senate inquiry, the federal government. And we'll continue to have further events and activities just to keep people talking and to have this citizen space for people. But if you could just hang on for 2 or 3 more minutes, and we'll email everyone with the information we've gleaned from your wonderful sharing. So everyone, poll number 2 is up. Please have a think and a fill out.
Thank you for those who have stayed around with us.
I would like to thank all of our guest speakers for your time and generosity and input today. We're really grateful. And I really want to thank everyone who's been with us from the beginning, and also anyone who had to jump off. We'll share this recording, and we'll invite all speakers to share their slides with us, and we'll try to get it all up on the website by next week. So that's a huge thank you to all of you, and an absolute plug and reminder, please do share your ideas. The submission form is easy, but if you have any trouble, email us at aela@earthlaws.org.au, and tribunal.org.au is the website. Follow the cuttlefish and you should find the correct place to go. We'll be hosting another discussion. We initially said September, but we think October might be good. We'll have a particular focus on updates on ecological impacts and updates on human health impacts. We may have some of our speakers from today, but additional speakers as well. Other than that, I personally want to thank Sean for working with me on this and reinvigorating the Citizens Tribunal as a space for people to share. We will be responsive if people tell us that we should all get together in Adelaide and have a massive turnout, really presenting core ideas to government. We'll help you do that. If people want to continue a few online discussions and leave it at that, we'll do that. But other than that, I will say thank you again and farewell. And Sean, the final word over to you and your turtle.
Look, yeah, thanks again, Michelle, for running the event today. Thank you. And thank you again to all the speakers. I think it's been very informative. Some of the comments I'm seeing coming through have been amazing. Very appreciative. And yeah, just watch this space. As Michelle mentioned, the information and the data from today will be going to the Senate inquiry. We've got an extension to the end of next week, and that will be submitted. So thank you for that. We'll see you at the next event. Thank you.
Yeah. And either email us or pop your comments in the submission anytime. We'll be replying to all emails. So thank you very much. And share with your friends, share with your contacts, share with anyone who's got an opinion on these issues. All right, everybody. Thank you very much. Take care. You're not alone. We all care about each other and somehow we'll make it through this. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.